October 17, 2023. A wealthy CEO stepped out of his office building on a freezing winter night and found an elderly woman unconscious on a nearby bench. But instead of calling for help and moving on, he sat down beside her in the cold and refused to leave. What happened in the hours that followed exposed a system that had been systematically ignoring homeless elders, and it forced his entire company to confront a question they'd been avoiding. How many vulnerable people are we walking past every single day, and what does our silence cost us? The offices of Meridian Solutions occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Blackstone Tower, a glass and steel monument to success that rose from the heart of downtown like a monument to ambition itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline in 3 directions. From the executive level, you couldn't see the streets below, only the architectural peaks of other empires, the clouds, the endless horizon of possibility. That was intentional. The view was designed to remind you that you were above it all, that you had made it, that the world below was someone else's problem. James Mitchell, the CEO of Meridian Solutions, had made his career understanding this kind of distance. At 56 years old, he had built a company that employed 3,200 people across 12 cities. Meridian specialized in logistics optimization, the art of moving goods and resources efficiently through complex systems. His company made billions by ensuring that supply chains worked, that nothing got lost, that every resource went exactly where it was supposed to go. It was, he often joked in interviews, the most important unglamorous work in modern business. James was not a man who trafficked in sentiment. He was pragmatic, numbers-driven. A Stanford graduate with an MBA from Wharton who had weathered 3 recessions, 2 market crashes, and the rise and fall of 4 different competitors. He had navigated corporate politics with the precision of a chess master. He had built a company culture that was, by most measures, exceptional. The employee satisfaction scores were high. The benefits package was competitive. The office environment was modern and designed by architects who understood that workspace reflected brand identity. James believed in systems. He believed that if you built the right systems with the right incentives and the right oversight, everything worked. People performed. Markets functioned. Problems got solved. Chaos was controlled. This philosophy had made him wealthy beyond most people's comprehension. His net worth exceeded $850 million. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park. He sat on the boards of 3 museums and a prestigious university. He was, by every measure that mattered in his world, a success. His company's downtown office sat on a corner of 5th and Harrison, in the financial district where glass towers cast long shadows and the streets hummed with purpose. The building had a main lobby with marble floors and an atrium that rose 12 stories. It had security checkpoints and revolving doors that stayed warm through the winter. Outside, separated by only the building's glass exterior, was the street. And on the street, in a city that grew colder every year, were people without the luxury of heated buildings, without systems that guaranteed shelter. James had never really thought about this contrast. It wasn't that he was unaware of it. He read the news, he understood that homelessness existed, that there were social problems that needed addressing. It was more that he had built his entire life and worldview around the assumption that these were systemic issues to be solved by systems, not by individuals. They were problems for nonprofits, for the government, for policymakers. They were not his responsibility. He had his own problems. A company to run. Investors to answer to. A board of directors who expected quarterly growth. A stock price that fluctuated based on market sentiment and earnings reports. The weather that December had been unusually harsh. The city had experienced an early freeze in November that should have broken but instead intensified. By mid-December, temperatures were dropping to the teens at night. The city's homeless shelters were operating at capacity. The news reported on overflow situations, on warming centers being opened, on the usual statistics that James would read over morning coffee and then compartmentalize away. James Mitchell's typical day was structured like clockwork. He arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m., traveled to his executive bathroom for a shower and fresh clothes kept in his office closet, then moved to his conference room for an 8 a.m. strategic briefing. There were meetings stacked throughout the day, board updates, investor calls, departmental reviews, quarterly planning sessions. His calendar was so full that his assistant, Rebecca, had to schedule even his lunch breaks. He left the building most days at 6:30 p.m., took a car service home, where he typically worked on his laptop until 10 p.m., then slept, then repeated. On this particular Tuesday in late December, James had a 5 p.m. board meeting that ran long. The quarterly earnings had come in slightly below expectations. Not bad, but not spectacular. Wall Street didn't like not spectacular. The board wanted to discuss cost optimization, which was a euphemism for where can we cut spending. James had sat in that conference room and talked about restructuring, about efficiency gains, about doing more with less. By the time he left the building, it was 7:45 p.m. The sun had been down for hours. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees. A wind was gusting down the canyon created by the buildings, turning the street into something hostile and unwelcoming. James wore a wool coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He wore gloves made from leather imported from Argentina. He wore a scarf that was cashmere. He was insulated from the cold in layers of expensive protection. His car service was waiting at the main entrance, idling in the taxi zone. As James stepped out of the revolving doors and began walking toward it, he glanced left down the side street toward Fifth Avenue. His typical route was to head straight to the car. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the angle of the light from a nearby street lamp. Maybe it was a detail his brain registered without his conscious mind processing it immediately. Maybe it was just randomness, a moment of attention that could have gone anywhere but happened to go there. On a concrete bench outside a closed coffee shop, partially obscured by the shadows of a store awning, was a figure. It took James a moment to register what he was looking at. Person. An elderly person. A woman, from what he could see, was lying on her side on a public bench in 14-degree weather wearing what appeared to be a thin jacket that hadn't been designed for this temperature. For a moment, James just looked. His brain processed the scene with the same analytical clarity he brought to everything. Homeless, elderly, alone, exposed, in danger. These were facts, data points. His mind automatically began categorizing. This is not my responsibility. This is a social services issue. This is what the city is supposed to handle. This is what shelters and nonprofits exist for. This is not something I solve. This is not my problem. He turned back toward his car. Then something happened that James couldn't quite explain, even as it was happening. A thought intruded. A single thought that didn't fit the framework he built his entire life around. A thought that asked, what if you looked closer? What if this specific person, not the abstract problem of homelessness, but this actual woman lying on this actual bench in this actual freezing cold, what if she was someone's problem to solve in this moment and that someone was you? James stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk, halfway between the bench and his waiting car service. The driver was watching him, confused about why he wasn't approaching. The rest of the world continued around him. Other people hurrying past, wrapped in their own urgency, their own insulated worlds. James turned back toward the bench. He walked toward the woman. And in that moment, in that small decision to walk toward instead of away, a system that had remained perfectly stable for 56 years began to crack without him even knowing it yet. He reached the bench and looked down at the woman's face. She appeared to be in her 70s, maybe 80s. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the streetlight. Her lips had a bluish tint. She wasn't moving. He couldn't tell if she was breathing. The bench was concrete. The temperature was 14 degrees. She had been here long enough, it seemed, that the cold had begun to slow everything down, her breath, her heartbeat, her consciousness. James did what his instincts suddenly told him to do. He sat down on the bench beside her, in the freezing cold, and he refused to leave. The car service driver watched as James Mitchell, his usual passenger who left precisely on schedule and arrived at his penthouse by 8:15 p.m. every evening, simply sat down on a public bench in freezing weather next to a homeless woman. The driver waited 5 minutes, then 10, then called dispatch to ask what he should do. James sat without moving. He didn't take the woman's pulse. He didn't know how to. He didn't try to move her. He simply sat there, his expensive coat absorbing the cold from the concrete, his breath visible in small clouds, his phone in his pocket. He had called 911 immediately before sitting down. An ambulance was coming. How long? The dispatcher didn't know. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 20. The city was busy. There were other emergencies. So James sat. And as he sat, the story he had told himself began to crack open. For the past 40 years, James had operated under a specific narrative about poverty and homelessness. It was a narrative that had been constructed piece by piece through conversations with other wealthy people, through news articles and statistics, through policy discussions and board meetings. The narrative went like this: homelessness is a systemic problem. It requires systemic solutions. Individual actions are well-meaning but ineffective and can even be counterproductive. The homeless population needs services, mental health treatment, job training, affordable housing, all things that require institutional intervention, not personal charity. A CEO's job is to run his company well, to create jobs, to pay taxes that fund social services. That's how you help. You don't help by sitting on benches in the cold. This narrative had always satisfied him. It provided a framework for why he didn't need to do more, why walking past didn't make him complicit, why the distance between his penthouse and the street below was acceptable. But narratives are fragile things. They only work as long as you don't look too closely at what they're built on. The ambulance arrived after 22 minutes. The paramedics were efficient and professional. They checked the woman's vitals. They asked James questions. Was she conscious when you found her? Did she fall or was she sleeping? Do you know her name? Has she taken anything? James couldn't answer most of these questions. He only knew what his eyes had told him. An elderly woman, alone, in freezing cold, apparently unconscious. They loaded her into the ambulance. One of the paramedics, a woman named Carla who appeared to be in her 50s, looked at James. "You did the right thing by calling," she said. "Another hour and she probably would have died. Hypothermia sets in fast at this temperature." James nodded. He felt something unfamiliar. Not quite relief, not quite guilt, but something in between. An awareness that a decision he'd made moments ago had prevented something terrible. That his sitting on a bench had literally been the difference between someone living and dying. "Where will she go?" he asked. "Will she be okay?" Carla hesitated. "Hospital tonight. For observation, warming protocol, checking for frostbite and any other medical issues. But after that," she shrugged, "she'll probably be discharged back to the streets. That's what usually happens. We stabilize them, they get released, and without housing, they end up back in the cold." The ambulance pulled away. James stood on the sidewalk in his expensive coat, watching it disappear. His car service was still waiting. His penthouse was still warm. His calendar was still full of meetings. The city continued around him exactly as it had before, as if nothing had happened. Except something had happened. The narrative had cracked. By the next morning, the story had become something else entirely. James had mentioned the incident to no one, but the ambulance had been visible. People had seen a well-dressed man sitting on a bench at night. By morning, it had become a story that moved through the building, through the gossip channels that exist in every organization. The CEO had been sleeping on a bench. Why? Was he having a breakdown? Was he okay? Was this a publicity stunt? By afternoon, it had morphed again. The CEO had kicked a homeless woman out of his building. The CEO was exploiting the homeless for some kind of real estate venture. The CEO was involved in something unsavory. None of it was true, but the speed with which these narratives formed and spread revealed something important. His company and his peers needed a story to explain his behavior that fit within their existing framework. And since his actual behavior, sitting with a suffering person for 22 minutes, didn't fit into their framework, they invented a framework that did. By Wednesday, Rebecca, his assistant, brought him a memo from the board's legal counsel. The memo expressed concern about the CEO's recent public activities and suggested that his focus should remain on the company, not on extracurricular social engagement. It was carefully worded, but the message was clear. Stop this. This is bad for the company. This is bad for the stock price. It's bad for investor confidence. There was also a news story. Someone had called the media. A CEO from a major corporation had abandoned a homeless woman on a bench in freezing weather, and the paramedics had to rescue her. The framing was devastating. He had created the problem. He was indifferent. He was responsible for her being there in the first place because his company, like all corporations, benefited from the systems that created homelessness. James read the article in his office on the 42nd floor, looking out at the skyline, feeling the distance between where he was and where the story was being told about him. The headline read, "Corporate Indifference. Local CEO's Neglect Exposes City's Homeless Crisis." He hadn't neglected her. He had sat with her in the freezing cold. But the narrative didn't allow for that. The narrative required him to be either a villain or a fool. He was a villain for the abandonment frame. He was a fool for the publicity stunt frame. His phone rang. It was Marcus Wellington, the board chairman. "James, we need to talk about containment. This story is spreading. We need a statement." "What kind of statement?" James asked. "Something that clarifies your role. Make it clear that while you care about social issues, your primary responsibility is to Meridian. That this incident doesn't reflect any broader shift in company direction or priorities." James looked out the window. 42 stories below, on a bench outside a coffee shop, someone was sitting. From this distance, he couldn't tell if it was a person or trash. From this distance, you couldn't tell the difference. "What if I don't want to minimize it?" James asked quietly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "James, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe I don't want to go back to the narrative where we pretend this isn't happening. Maybe I want to understand why a woman was dying on a bench outside my building." Another pause. Then Marcus said, very carefully, "That sounds like something that could significantly impact your leadership here. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're committing to." The threat was implicit but clear. Step back into line or face consequences. James hung up the phone. For the first time in his career, he faced a decision that his systems and frameworks didn't have an answer for. He could apologize, minimize, and move forward. He could reclaim his narrative and the safety of distance. Or he could do something his entire life had trained him never to do. He could prioritize a human being over the system built to protect him. The woman's name, he would later discover, was Dorothy Crawford. She was 78 years old. She had been a teacher for 35 years before her pension became insufficient and her medical bills depleted her savings. She had been living on the streets for 3 years. In 12 hours of exposure to 14-degree weather, she had developed severe frostbite on both feet and early-stage hypothermia. The hospital saved her life. But the system, the one James had always trusted to handle these things, had no plan for what came next. Neither did James. But for the first time, he was beginning to understand that maybe the system wasn't broken because of the way it was designed. Maybe the system was broken because people like him had decided long ago that they weren't responsible for seeing it. Patricia Huang had worked in Meridian Solutions' Human Resources Department for 18 years. She was 54 years old, a single mother who had raised 2 kids on a middle management salary, and she had spent her career watching systems work, and watching people disappear from those systems when they became inconvenient. She had processed layoffs. She had managed early retirement packages. She had attended meetings where the cost-benefit analysis of keeping a long-term employee versus hiring a cheaper replacement was discussed with the same emotional distance as discussing office supplies. Patricia had also seen James Mitchell sit down on a bench in freezing cold for a woman he didn't know. She had been leaving the building around 8 p.m. that Tuesday evening, heading to her car in the parking garage. She had passed by the side exit and glanced out the glass doors. She had seen the car service waiting. She had seen James sitting on a bench. She had watched as an ambulance arrived. She had watched as paramedics evaluated the unconscious woman. She had watched him sit there, refusing to move, until they took her away. Patricia had said nothing. She had gone home. But she had watched the story transform over the next few days with a clarity that came from years of watching institutional narratives form. By Thursday morning, she made a decision that would cost her something. She recorded a video on her personal phone, speaking directly into the camera from her kitchen before work. She wasn't an actress. She wasn't polished. She just spoke the truth as she had witnessed it. My name is Patricia Huang, she began. I'm a human resources director at Meridian Solutions. I've worked there for 18 years. And I want to tell you what I actually saw on Tuesday evening, because the story being told is not the story that happened. I watched the CEO of my company, James Mitchell, sit on a public bench in 14-degree weather next to a homeless woman who was unconscious and at risk of death. He called an ambulance. He waited with her for over 20 minutes until that ambulance arrived. He sat there because a human being was suffering, and he chose not to walk away. That's not negligence. That's not a publicity stunt. That's someone recognizing that distance and systems aren't always an acceptable substitute for presence and action. I also watched my company's institutional response to this act of basic humanity. I watched the board send him messages suggesting he step back. I watched the media distort what happened into something that made him look like the problem. I watched everyone try to put him back into his box, back into the narrative where the CEO is removed from consequence, where he doesn't have to see what his company's role might be in a world where people freeze to death on benches. I want to ask my company something. If the CEO can sit on a bench in the cold with a suffering woman, why can't we as an organization? If he can choose to see her, why are we working so hard to make sure we don't? She posted the video on her personal social media accounts. She included the hashtag #SeeDorothy, using the woman's name, humanizing her in a way the institutional narrative hadn't. The video spread, slowly at first, then faster, because it was authentic, because it came from inside the system, because it asked a question that people had been avoiding. What would we do if we actually looked? Patricia knew there would be consequences. There always are when you speak inside a system that prefers silence. Her boss called her into his office on Friday morning. Patricia, that video, he said carefully. The board is concerned. They feel you're making assumptions about company direction that aren't accurate. I'm not making assumptions, Patricia said. I'm describing what I witnessed. I'm asking a question about what we do with that witness. The concern is that you're speaking as a company employee while criticizing company decisions. I'm not criticizing, Patricia said. I'm testifying. There's a difference. Her boss shifted uncomfortably. The conversation ended without resolution, but both of them understood what had happened. Patricia had broken the code. She had looked inside the system and spoken about what she saw. But something shifted in the company as well. The video created permission for other people to speak. Other employees began posting their own stories about homelessness they'd witnessed, about people they'd walked past, about the cognitive dissonance between their company's mission to optimize systems and their complete absence from systems of care. Most importantly, the video changed what James Mitchell could do. He had been isolated, questioned, facing pressure to recant and step back. Now he had a witness. He had someone from inside the system confirming that his choice had meaning, that it wasn't crazy or performative, that maybe, just maybe, choosing to see what had been made invisible was worth the cost. 3 days later, James called Patricia into his office. For the first time since all of this began, he was smiling. I don't know if you know what you did, he said, but you changed the conversation. You made it possible for me to keep going. You looked and you testified. Thank you. Patricia nodded. So what now? She asked. James turned to look out the window at the city below. Now, he said, we figure out what it means to run a company that actually sees the people around it. James visited Dorothy Crawford in the hospital on Friday morning. He hadn't planned to. His calendar was full. His board was waiting for him to issue a statement that would close this matter. His stock price was vulnerable, but he went anyway. Dorothy was conscious now, awake, aware. The frostbite on her feet was severe enough that doctors weren't yet certain whether amputation would be necessary. Her medical records, which James was able to access because he'd listed himself as an emergency contact, told a story he'd never seen before, because he'd never looked. Dorothy had been treated for hypothermia 7 times in the past 3 years. 7. She'd been to the emergency room for frostbite twice before. She'd been discharged with social work referrals that led nowhere. She'd been connected to shelters that were always full. She'd been prescribed medications she couldn't afford and told to follow up with doctors she couldn't reach. The system had seen her multiple times. It had documented her. It had released her back to the streets knowing exactly what would happen. The system worked perfectly. It just wasn't designed to actually help her. "Mr. Mitchell," Dorothy said when she saw him. Her voice was small. I don't understand why you're here. I wanted to know if you were okay," James said. Dorothy looked at him like he'd said something in a language she didn't speak. "Nobody visits," she said quietly. "Unless they're taking something. Unless they want something. Why are you visiting?" James didn't have an answer that made sense inside the frameworks of his world. So he just sat with her, like he had on the bench. Later that afternoon, James called an emergency board meeting. He walked in with documents that Patricia had helped him gather. Hospital discharge data, shelter capacity reports, city statistics on chronic homelessness, cold weather deaths, the cost-benefit analysis of letting people freeze versus the cost of actually providing care. "Dorothy Crawford," he began, "is one of approximately 3,400 chronically homeless people in this city. Of those, approximately 280 have been to the emergency room more than 10 times in the past year. We've all been calling this a social services problem, a government problem, a non-profit problem, but it's actually a cost allocation problem." He placed the documents on the table. Emergency room visits for homeless individuals cost between $400 and $2,000 per visit. Most of the chronically homeless people cost the city over $50,000 a year in emergency services. It costs approximately $35,000 a year to provide stable housing and basic services. In other words, we've designed a system that is more expensive and less effective than the obvious alternative. One of the board members, David Foster, leaned back in his chair. "James, I understand the moral argument, but this isn't Meridian's responsibility." "Actually," James said, "I think it is, not because of charity, but because we benefit from the system that creates homelessness. We have offices in neighborhoods where homeless people are criminalized for existing. We pay rent in a city where housing costs have exploded. We employ people whose wages don't keep them housed. We're complicit in the system, so we have a choice. We can continue to distance ourselves from that complicity, or we can acknowledge it and do something." "Do what?" asked Elizabeth Chun, the board's legal counsel. "Create a Housing First program for Meridian employees and their families," James said. "Partner with nonprofits to provide stable housing for chronically homeless individuals in neighborhoods where we operate. Use our real estate partnerships to advocate for affordable housing development. Reimagine what corporate responsibility looks like." The board was silent. Marcus Wellington, the board chair, spoke slowly. "You understand this would be a significant financial commitment. It would impact our bottom line." "It would," James agreed. "But we spend millions on corporate philanthropy that makes us feel good while changing nothing. This would actually change something." "And if it fails?" someone asked. "Then we fail," James said. "But Dorothy won't freeze to death because we were afraid to try." The board voted. It wasn't unanimous. 3 members abstained. But the motion passed. Meridian Solutions would allocate $15 million annually toward a Housing First initiative, starting immediately with Dorothy Crawford. But something more important happened in that meeting. The reversal wasn't about James convincing the board. It was about the board being forced to see what James had seen. The data, the people, the choice between distance and engagement. Within hours, the story shifted. The media narrative that had painted James as negligent or performative suddenly faced evidence that he'd been right all along. That the real story wasn't his choice to help one woman. It was the system's choice to let thousands suffer. The press conference was held at the hospital where Dorothy lay recovering. James stood with Dorothy present, not as a symbol but as a person. He explained the program. He named the problem. He didn't position Meridian as a savior. He positioned them as complicit and choosing, finally, to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Dorothy looked at him during the press conference. For the first time since this began, she smiled. The reversal was complete. The company that had tried to silence James now found itself leading a conversation about corporate responsibility and systemic change. The narrative that had attacked him became the story of his courage. And the woman everyone had been trained not to see became the center of a new conversation about what visibility actually means. 3 weeks after the board meeting, James Mitchell sat alone in his penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was a Sunday evening. He had the entire apartment to himself, which was most evenings. He'd been married once 20 years ago. That had ended when he admitted he cared more about building his company than building a marriage. He had no children. He had colleagues and board members and people who reported to him, but he had no one who actually knew him. He was looking through old emails. Emails from 1998 when Meridian was young and he still worked out of a cramped office with 4 employees. He found an email he'd written to an investor. It said, "Our mission is to optimize systems so that resources reach the people who need them most efficiently. We believe technology and strategy can solve human problems." He had believed that. He still did, technically. But something was broken in the framework. He pulled up Dorothy's file. Her complete file now. Everything the hospital had shared. Her medical history. Her Social Security benefits, which amounted to $1,847 per month. The cost of a studio apartment in the cheapest neighborhood, $1,200. Food, medication, utilities, $500. That left her $147 a month for everything else. The math didn't work. The system hadn't failed her. The system had calculated correctly that she couldn't survive on what it allocated her. He thought about the paramedic's comment. Another hour and she probably would have died. The system had been working exactly as designed. It had been designed to let people like Dorothy die slowly, to move them into hospitals for emergency intervention, and then release them back to the streets. It was efficient. It was systematic. It was what happened when you built frameworks that didn't include the possibility that a person deserved to live. His phone rang. It was his former business partner, Thomas Richardson, calling from his house in the Hamptons. Thomas had been at the early stages of Meridian, then left to start his own firm. They hadn't spoken in 6 years. "I saw your press conference," Thomas said. "I wanted to tell you this is a mistake. You're positioning Meridian as responsible for social problems that aren't your responsibility. It signals weakness to investors. It makes you look like you're losing focus." James listened. A month ago, this would have made perfect sense to him. Thomas was saying what the board had said, what his instincts had said, what 40 years of business culture had trained him to say. "Do you know what Dorothy Crawford did for a living?" James asked. "I don't care," Thomas said. "I care about what this costs Meridian." "She was a schoolteacher," James said. "For 35 years. She taught children to read. And now she sleeps on benches because the system doesn't value what she did enough to let her survive retirement." James, this is exactly the kind of thinking that destroys companies. This emotional engagement with problems that aren't yours to solve. James hung up. And in hanging up, he understood something. The framework he'd spent his entire career building wasn't about solving problems. It was about creating distance between himself and the consequences of his choices. It was about never having to see. It was about making sure that systems did the seeing for you so you could pretend you hadn't chosen what the systems chose. The next day, he met with his therapist. He'd been seeing one for a year, initially for stress management, but increasingly for something deeper. Something that had to do with loneliness and disconnection and the way distance had shaped every relationship in his life. "Tell me about Dorothy," his therapist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, said. James talked for 40 minutes. About finding her. About sitting with her. About the hospital visit. About the moment he understood that the system hadn't failed. It had succeeded at exactly what it was designed to do. "What do you think that moment changed in you?" Elena asked. "It made me realize," James said slowly, "that I've been hiding, that I've been using systems as an excuse not to see people, that I've been complicit in a kind of violence, not violent action but violent inaction, knowing someone is suffering and choosing not to see them. Can you live differently now?" Elena asked. "I don't know," James said. "I'm not even sure what that looks like. Every part of my world is built on not seeing." my company, my relationships, my life. How do you rebuild that? One choice at a time, Elena said. You sat on a bench in the cold for 22 minutes. That was one choice. The board meeting was another. What's the next one? James thought about this. The next choice wasn't about Meridian. It wasn't about programs or policies. It was smaller and much harder. It was about how he moved through the world. It was about whether he could actually change who he was, not just what his company did. I think, he said, I need to spend less time in towers looking at skylines and more time on streets looking at people. That's a start, Elena said. That night, James did something he'd never done before. He called his sister, Rebecca, whom he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. They lived in the same city. They had just stopped trying. Hi, he said when she answered. I know I haven't been a good brother. I want to change that. Can I buy you dinner this week? There was silence on the other end. Then, yeah, I'd like that. It was a small thing, but it was real. It was choosing to see someone he'd been trained to ignore. And it was the beginning of understanding that the work wasn't about what he did at Meridian. It was about becoming someone capable of actually seeing. 6 weeks after the board approved the Housing First initiative, James called an all-hands meeting. Every employee of Meridian Solutions was invited. The company blocked out for 2 hours. The auditorium was packed with 1,200 people, and another 2,000 watched via video feed from other offices. James stood alone on stage, no slides, no presentation deck, just a man and a microphone. I want to tell you about a decision I've made regarding how we operate as a company, he began. For 40 years, Meridian has been built on a principle of optimization. We optimize systems to move resources efficiently. We measure success in metrics and quarterly returns. And we've been successful by those measures. But I've come to realize that we've optimized something that was broken from the beginning. He explained the Housing First program. He explained the data about emergency services costs versus preventive housing costs. He explained Dorothy Crawford, not as a charity case but as evidence of systemic failure. But here's what I want to change beyond that, James said. I want Meridian to stop pretending that business happens in a vacuum. Every office we occupy is in a neighborhood. Every employee we hire is part of a community. Every profit we make is extracted from an economy that includes people we've decided not to see. He announced 3 structural changes. First, Meridian would establish an Office of Community Impact in every city where they operated. These offices would have real budget, real authority, and real accountability. They would study homelessness, food insecurity, housing costs, and employment barriers in their neighborhoods. They would report directly to James, not to the PR department. Second, every Meridian employee would have the option to spend 1 paid week per year on community service. Not volunteering as a charity, but as part of understanding the communities their company operated in. Employees would work in shelters, in nonprofits, in community centers. They would see what they'd been trained not to see. Third, and most controversial, Meridian would commit to fair wage contracting. Every vendor, every contractor, every service provider hired by Meridian would be required to pay employees a living wage adjusted for local cost of living. This would increase costs significantly, but, James argued, it would also address one of the root causes of homelessness: jobs that didn't pay enough to live. The reaction was immediate and divided. Patricia Huang stood and applauded. Others joined her, but not everyone. In the Q&A session that followed, a senior manager named David Carlson raised his hand. With all respect, James, this sounds like we're taking responsibility for problems that aren't ours to solve. Fair wage contracting will increase costs. That impacts our competitiveness. That impacts our stock price. That impacts shareholder returns. How do you justify that to investors? James nodded. I don't. I justify it to myself. I justify it to Dorothy Crawford, who I visit every week as she recovers. I justify it to every person working full-time for a vendor of ours who can't afford an apartment in the city where they work. If you want to work for a company that optimizes everything except human dignity, there are other companies. But this isn't one anymore. Carlson sat down. The room was quiet. What followed over the next 2 months was a slow organizational shift. Some people left. They went to companies with cleaner ethical frameworks, where distance was still acceptable. Others stayed but resisted. The fair wage contracting requirement created real tension with some of Meridian's largest partners. Several threatened to end contracts. James let them, and he hired new vendors who met the requirements. It was more expensive. The profit margins shifted. The stock price dipped slightly, then stabilized. Investors who cared primarily about maximizing returns moved their money elsewhere. Investors who were interested in long-term sustainability and responsible business practices moved in. Patricia Huang was promoted to head the Office of Community Impact. She hired a team of 10 people whose job was to actually know the neighborhoods where Meridian operated. Not as data points, as communities. They conducted interviews with homeless individuals. They identified barriers. They made recommendations. One of those recommendations changed everything. Patricia noticed that a significant percentage of Meridian's own employees were struggling with housing insecurity. People who worked full-time for a company that was now worth billions couldn't afford apartments in the city where they worked. The system had been invisible to James because it mostly affected lower-wage workers, administrative staff, maintenance crews, security guards, people who weren't in meetings with him. "We're part of the problem," Patricia told him. "We pay our employees, but we also benefit from a city where their wages aren't enough. We need to take responsibility for our own employees first." James approved a new policy. Meridian would provide housing assistance to employees earning below $80,000 per year. The company would cover the difference between 30% of their salary, the recommended housing cost threshold, and their actual rent. For the first time in Meridian's history, low-wage workers weren't quietly struggling. They weren't sleeping in their cars. They had security. The impact on employee retention was dramatic. Turnover in lower-wage positions dropped from 35% annually to 8%. Training costs decreased. Productivity increased. Knowledge stayed in the company. The financial analysis that Patricia presented showed that the housing assistance actually paid for itself through increased efficiency. But more importantly, something changed inside the company culture. Suddenly, the person who cleaned the office at night wasn't invisible. The person who managed security wasn't a background figure. They were people. They had faces. They had struggles. And they had the same CEO who sat on a bench in freezing cold sitting in their meetings, asking what they needed. By month 3, 12 Meridian employees had housing who didn't before. 57 more had rental assistance. And in neighborhoods where Meridian operated, the Housing First initiative had moved 73 people into stable housing. Not all of them stayed housed. Chronic homelessness is complicated. But 73 people who had been sleeping in the freezing cold now had beds. Dorothy Crawford was one of them. After 8 weeks of recovery, her feet had healed enough that amputation wasn't necessary, though she would walk with significant pain for the rest of her life. Meridian provided her with housing, medication, and physical therapy. She also got something else, a job. Working part-time in Meridian's Community Impact Office, helping design programs based on her lived experience. "I'm not a case study," she told James during one meeting. "I'm not a charity project." "I know," James said. "You're a teacher. You spent 35 years teaching children. You're still teaching, just different students now." The structural shifts were complete. The systems that had been built to create distance had been rebuilt to create connection. It wasn't perfect. Resistance remained from those who benefited from the old system. But for the first time, Meridian was operating as if the people around it actually mattered. James Mitchell sat in a small apartment in a neighborhood called Riverside, which had once been marked on mental maps as dangerous. Now it was becoming the neighborhood where Meridian's Housing First initiative had begun to reshape the block. The apartment belonged to a woman named Susan Torres, who had been chronically homeless for 4 years before Meridian's program found her. This was part of James's routine now. One evening per week, he visited someone living in housing provided by the initiative. Not as a CEO checking on outcomes, as a human being having dinner with another human being. Susan had made pasta. It was simple and good. They ate together while her 2 adult children, whom she'd been estranged from during her years on the streets, sat nearby. "I still can't believe this is real," Susan said, looking around her apartment. "Every morning I wake up, and I think maybe I'll go back outside, like I'm still supposed to be there." "You're not," James said. "You're here, and you get to stay." Susan's daughter, Maria, looked at James. "She keeps saying that, like she feels guilty for having a home." James understood that. He'd spent so much of his life training himself not to feel responsible for anything outside his immediate control that the opposite now sometimes overwhelmed him. Sitting in an apartment with a family reunited because of a decision he'd made felt enormous and fragile, and like it could disappear if he wasn't careful enough. After dinner, he walked through the neighborhood. Meridian had funded 3 new community centers in Riverside. There was a medical clinic specializing in care for formerly homeless populations. There was a job training program. There were small green spaces where homeless individuals had once slept on concrete now being transformed into places for community. The changes had costs. Real costs. Meridian's profit margins were lower than they'd been before. The stock price had leveled off rather than climbing exponentially. Some investors had moved their money. Some employees who couldn't adapt to the new culture had left. The company was smaller in some ways but deeper in others. Marcus Wellington, the board chair, had gradually shifted his position. He'd initially resisted every change. But something had happened to him too. His daughter had interned in the Community Impact Office over the summer. She'd spent 8 weeks working directly with formerly homeless individuals, listening to their stories, understanding their barriers. She'd come home different, and Marcus had come home different because of her. "I didn't understand," he told James in a board meeting. "I thought we were being naive about systemic problems. But I realize now I was just being lazy. I was using complexity as an excuse not to try." The board had voted, unanimously, to increase the community impact budget to $20 million annually. They'd also voted to raise the salaries of Meridian's lowest-wage employees by 15%, on top of the housing assistance. The company could afford it. More importantly, it was right. But not everything had changed smoothly. There had been complications. One of Meridian's regional directors, Thomas Morrison, had tried to circumvent the fair wage contracting requirement in his district. He'd discovered a loophole where certain vendors could be classified differently to avoid the policy. When Patricia discovered it, she'd brought it directly to James. James had called Thomas into a meeting. "You're trying to work around the policy," James said. "I'm trying to keep us competitive," Thomas replied. "The policy is killing our margins in the Western region." "Then we accept lower margins in the Western region," James said. "Or you find a different job. Those are your options." Thomas had chosen a different job. He left to work for a competitor with fewer ethical constraints. His replacement, a woman named Lisa Foster, came to the role with clear eyes about what Meridian was trying to do. Within 2 months, she'd restructured the Western region's contracts to be both competitive and compliant with fair wage requirements. She just needed different instructions. Dorothy Crawford had returned to teaching. She'd taken her experience at Meridian, her year of working part-time in the Community Impact Office, and had approached a charter school about starting a curriculum around homeless advocacy. The school had hired her as their first director of community integration. She was no longer a case study. She was an expert. Her lived experience was valued as knowledge. She and James met for coffee every other week. They weren't friends, exactly. There was still an element of his debt to her, his gratitude for what she'd taught him about distance and responsibility. But something closer to an authentic relationship was developing. He asked her questions. She didn't always have answers, but she answered honestly. "Do you think I should have done more?" James asked one afternoon. "More than sitting on a bench and then restructuring your company?" Dorothy smiled slightly. "I think you did what people can do when they finally decide to look. You can't save everyone. You can't fix everything. But you can save one person. You can fix something." "Doesn't feel like enough," James said. "It's not enough for systemic problems," Dorothy agreed. "But it's everything for individual people. And individual people are the only scale that actually matters when you're the one freezing on a bench. The penthouse apartment hadn't changed much physically, but James felt different in it now. He'd donated the value of the furniture to the Community Impact Initiative, not as a tax write-off, but because looking at things he'd bought specifically to signal status had started to feel empty. He'd furnished it more simply. He'd also invited his sister, Rebecca, to stay there when she visited from her home in Vermont. They've had dinner 3 times a month now for 9 months. They were rebuilding something that had been broken by years of distance. At work, the culture continued to shift. The mandatory community service week had become something people looked forward to. Employees who had spent their careers in offices, invisible from consequence, were now spending time in shelters, in job training programs, in communities their company was affected. They came back changed. They made better decisions because they understood who those decisions affected. Meridian's stock price had stabilized at a level lower than it would have been under the old model, but stable. Investors understood that this was a company choosing sustainability over maximum extraction. Some investors preferred that. Others didn't. The market was being honest about what the company was choosing. There had been a study released by a research organization tracking outcomes. 78 people who had been chronically homeless had now been stably housed through Meridian's initiative for over 6 months. Medical emergency visits for that population had dropped 67%. 63% had secured employment. The data supported what James had argued. Housing First was more effective and more efficient than the alternative. But more than the data, there was a feeling in Meridian that had changed. The company was no longer optimizing for distance. It was optimized for visibility. Every system was being asked, does this help us see the people we affect? Or does this help us not see them? The answer had changed how everything worked. One afternoon in late September, James walked past the bench where he'd found Dorothy. The weather was cool but not yet cold. The bench was empty. He stood there for a moment, remembering the moment he'd chosen to sit down instead of walking away. Remembering how that choice had led him here, to a company transformed, to relationships rebuilt, to an understanding of what responsibility actually meant. He would never know if he'd made the right choices. Systemic problems don't have clean solutions. Some people who had been homeless were still homeless. Some of Meridian's changes hadn't worked. Some people had benefited immensely and some barely at all. The problem was still too large, still too structural, still requiring more than any one company could do. But something had fundamentally shifted. A man who had built his entire life around distance had chosen, on a freezing night, to sit with a stranger. And that choice had created ripples outward. Not ripples that fixed everything, but ripples that made it harder for people to pretend they weren't seeing. As James walked away from the bench, back toward the Meridian building where people were already arriving for their evening shifts, he understood something. Redemption wasn't a destination you reached. It was a direction you moved in. It was a commitment to keep choosing visibility over distance, connection over systems, people over optimization. He didn't know how long he could maintain that. But he knew that as long as Dorothy Crawford existed, as long as Susan Torres was walking through her apartment each morning remembering it was real, as long as Meridian employees spent 1 week per year seeing what they'd been trained not to see, the choice would keep being made. And maybe that was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough.